That is part of the struggle. But what does that mean? It means, of course, that besides the business of fights in the streets and demonstrations and so forth against the government, besides the business of liberation movements that have adopted violent approaches, there are millions and millions of South Africans who are engaging in that quiet, desperate struggle against the apartheid regime in the quiet, desperate ways that ordinary people can. Through their work, through their jobs, through their lives, through their education of their children, through their efforts to get better houses for themselves, through their efforts to achieve a better life in ordinary ways for their people. And that, it seems to me, leads one to ask a question about the whole disinvestment approach, in addition to asking a question that I think should lead in other directions. And that is this. There are a lot of people out there who know what they are against in South Africa. They are against apartheid. They know what they wish to destroy in South Africa. They wish to destroy apartheid. But I wonder if it's ever enough, whether in that situation or any other, to know what it is you wish to destroy. Since in the end, the destruction of apartheid has to be the building up of something else. And so the question one has to ask is not just what harm can we do to the apartheid system. The question you have to ask is what good are we going to do for the people of South Africa, and particularly for the black people in South Africa who have to bear the brunt of the daily struggle against the abuses and injustices of the apartheid regime. What good are we going to do? And I sometimes wish that the folks who really supported the disinvestment approach would think about that hard. Because one goes through the arguments, and I've been through them many times with many different people. You go through the arguments. And at the end of the day, you get to the point where we get into a discussion about, well, yes, we admit that disinvestment by the United States will only have a symbolic effect. It may not be, given the relative size of our investments in South Africa and so forth, really have that much of an influence or impact on the South African government. Yes, it is going to have adverse impacts on the black people of South Africa, but they are willing to make these sacrifices in the interest of achieving their own justice and freedom. And in a certain sense, you go through that whole logic, and it's a way of excusing away, rationalizing away, the fact that this investment is not a strategy aimed at doing any good to the black people of South Africa. It's a strategy aimed at convincing them that we are on their side, aimed at convincing ourselves that our heart is in the right place. But when you go through it rationally, step by step, to try to ask yourself a few questions. How many people is this investment going to educate? Whose health is it going to improve? Whose housing is it going to improve? How many people is it going to give the kind of educational, organizational expertise, the managerial expertise that is needed not only to carry on one's daily life, but also, in case you haven't noticed, to organize politically in order to struggle for one's rights? How many people is it going to help? And I wish that people would put that question to themselves and then try to tick it off. Because you won't come up with much. You will come up with symbolic gestures. You will come up with satisfied indignation. You will come up with an outlet for moral feeling. But you will not come up with much in the way of concrete results for the black people of South Africa. And then you have to ask yourself another question. Because part of the disinvestment strategy is part of the strategy that has been outlined in the UN, that seems to have been the orthodoxy for a long time, which is to say that the way to handle the South African system is to isolate South Africa from the world community, and that somehow that is going to precipitate its collapse. There is no particular reason in experience, either in Africa or elsewhere, to actually believe that will come about. But that is the basic premise of the approach. But the thing that has always bothered me is that if we isolate the white South Africans, and we are not there in South Africa in some way involved in the situation, what everybody forgets is that we isolated the black South Africa. And if those of us who recognize the evil of the system and have some power and influence in the situation directly to work in order to change it, are not there working for that change, then you tell me who is going to be. It's one of those paradoxes. It's a very touchy subject to talk about with regard to this, but you can see it practically speaking. The brunt of the problem in South Africa, human terms, falls in the so-called homelands. The urban areas are the areas we hear most about, because they're the areas where certain changes in material circumstances, education, and so forth have heightened the political consciousness and the organizational wherewithal, I'll talk about that in a minute, for people to struggle against apartheid. So we see that struggle there. What we don't see is the quiet misery, the ongoing daily destruction of a whole people that is taking place in the homelands in South Africa. And it's very difficult even to talk about them, because neither my government or any other government recognizes their existence as such. But it's strange but true that the failure to recognize their existence has also inhibited any effort to try to produce the kind of ferment, turmoil, and struggle against apartheid in those areas that one can see in other areas outside the homeland where involvement such as our own is heavier. It's just something to think about, because it means that if you isolate the phenomenon, you say, all right, that's evil, I'll have nothing to do with it. That also limits your ability to do anything to overcome that evil. And it leaves the process, in this particular case, in the hands of the most extreme elements. The extreme elements in the white community, who are dead set against any change in apartheid and will fight to the death to see that it is not about. The extreme elements in the anti-apartheid movement, influenced sometimes by leftist external forces, who see the situation in terms of the worse the better. And if eventually a cataclysmic conflict should come to South Africa, in which AK-47s are the arbiters of South Africa's future, and in which the arts of destruction have become the main arts for addressing the problem, then they will benefit. And they have benefited in other parts of the world, other parts of Africa even. Perhaps to their own good, but if you think about the record in Ethiopia and other places, not very much to the good of the people there. Is that the future that we want for Southern Africa? I sincerely hope not. Is that what we wish the black majority in South Africa eventually to inherit as its political legacy? A legacy of ruin and destruction. A legacy of domination by those who are practiced in the arts of ruin and destruction, I hope. If there were no other way, if one could see no other alternative, then I suppose it would make sense. You sort of wash your hands, put yourself on the side of the angels, and let the inevitable happen. But I wonder whether one can fairly make the case that it is inevitable. And I'm not going to argue from our own experience in this country. We live in very different circumstances and situations than the South Africans. But I do think it's nice to remind ourselves that if you had talked to your average American 60 or 70 years ago, he would have assured you that change would be difficult. And he would have been absolutely adamant about the fact that it was impossible. Any kind of change. But we will leave that aside. And look at the kind of realities in the South African situation and ask ourselves, well, do those realities suggest that the situation cannot be changed except in the course of some kind of cataclysmic struggle? And I would wonder. I especially wonder when one looks at the kind of changes that have occurred in the South African economy over the course of the last 20 or 25 years. Like many countries in the third world, South Africa was primarily an agro-mineral-based society. And if you look at the roots of Afrikaner nationalism, the roots of that nationalism lie primarily in the agricultural sectors of South Africa, the die-hard farmers of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, looking back to their long traditions, which included struggle against the British and enslavement of the white populations in South Africa, with great pride and with great antagonism toward anybody who wishes to change their situation. But then you look at another phenomenon that has grown up, as it has in other parts of the world, in which through the influences of the modern economy, the development of a more urbanized civilization, you have begun to attract people in South Africa, black and white, into the same cosmopolitan sort of melting pot that exists in many different parts of the third world, and which in many parts of the third and developing world have begun to break down traditional values and notions in order to substitute for them behavior and attitudes and ideas that are more suited to an environment of economic progress. Well, it just happens, in my opinion, that the roots, ideological roots of apartheid are just such a traditional notion, with its roots in the land. And it is precisely back to those roots apart from the development of the modern economy. It's precisely, back to those roots, that the strategists of disinvestment seem intent on driving South African society. Precisely away from the locus of those forces that show the most promise of producing actual change, toward those forces that have been mostly responsible for the implantation and maintenance of this destructive and inhuman system. And I just have to ask myself, does that make sense? Is it an accident that it is not in the agricultural sector that one has seen the most struggle against apartheid by the black community? It is precisely in those areas where the impact of modern economic change has been most pronounced. Port Elizabeth, Cape Town, Johannesburg. Precisely in those sectors where the importance of black Africans as laborers and making other contributions to the society have been most pronounced. Where, in a certain sense, their power can be greatest. And this is something that everybody neglects, Always talk about the power of the whites in South Africa with a racist, I think, preoccupation with that fact. Unwilling to look at what can be the sources of black empowerment in that situation. And one of the prime sources of black empowerment in that situation, as it had been in the course of some of the colonial struggles in Africa, for those of you who know, has been the labor movement, the organized labor movement in South Africa. Now, when was the last time you saw a labor movement without an economy, a fairly developed industrial economy, that required the labor force which was being organized by that movement? Fact. Several years ago, if you had looked at a company like GM, you would have seen 85% of the workforce white. You look at that same, and the 15% that were black would mostly have been sweeping up the floors and so forth and so on. You look at that same workforce in South Africa today, you will find approaching 70, 80, 85% of that workforce white. And that makes a difference. And it not only makes a difference in terms of why white attitudes have changed, that does not interest me. What interests me is that those 85% of that black workforce, they have an opportunity. And if they can get organized to exploit that opportunity, then they have power to deal with and shape their environment. Now, the forces of disinvestment, I suppose, would like us to destroy that power because they want us to destroy that environment. And I do not understand why. As I say often to my colleagues in the United Nations, if you destroy that environment, you are doing the work of the oppressor. Because there are forces being unleashed in that modern economic environment, power being inevitably placed in the hands of black people in that environment, which you would take away. And I can't understand why. It seems to me that, yes, I'm not making an argument, mind you, that people have gone to South Africa and invested in order to do good for black people. I'm too Adam Smithian for that. But I do believe that if you send people out there, it's not entirely clear to me that they want to do the right thing or that they want to do good things, but that doesn't keep you from seeing analytically and objectively what the results have or have not been, and to try to take advantage of the fact that those results are moving things in a better rather than a worse direction. Instead of that, the approach of a lot of people seems to be, we hate this system, we want to have nothing to do with this system, and we don't care what consequences, in a negative way, our action in order to show our moral indignation is going to have on the actual power of the people who have to deal with that situation every day. I think it makes a tremendous difference. I think we betrayed our real intentions when we find ourselves having to rationalize for other people the sacrifices that they are going to have to make because of actions that we take. There's a big debate, Do black people in South Africa favor sanctions or don't they favor sanctions? When people go to South Africa and they talk to black people there and they are told by a lot of them that they don't favor sanctions, is that because the government won't let them talk about sanctions? Is it because the government is going to punish them and so forth and so on? Now, but I think it's always wiser not to look at what people say. To look at what they do tells you a lot more about their situation. Okay, let us assume, as many people say, the black people in South Africa are prepared to give up their jobs, to give up the wages that help them to support their families, to see their wives and children and spouses suffer for the sake of eliminating apartheid. They are ready to make this sacrifice. All we have to do is impose it upon them, and they will stand up and cheer. And then I ask myself, why do they have to wait for us? There are people, black people in South Africa who want to give up their jobs. They can give them up right now. They just stay home. They just sit and do nothing. That is not the approach that they have taken. They have made other choices across a whole spectrum of possibilities. And a lot of those choices include taking advantage of the opportunities that have been created either by foreign investment or the development in domestic terms of South Africa's modern economy. And in fact, if you look at the labor movements, if you look at the cultural movements, if you look at the kind of civic organizations, the spearhead of change in the black community, I'm not talking about whites here, I'm talking about black people and their political consciousness in South Africa, have come in those urban areas, have come in the environment of that kind of economic change. The very change that for some reason, there are forces all over the place who would like us to see to a grinding halt. And who would like to see the U.S. contribution to that kind of change eliminated rather than enhanced. I think that there is an entirely different approach to this problem. One that recognizes the kind of power and influence that can result for us through the presence of our corporations in South Africa, some of whom, especially over the course of the last 6 or 7 years, have begun to take their corporate social responsibility more seriously. And all of the kind of effort that I see going into grassroots movements to get us out of the situation in South Africa, they worry me. What happens on the day after disinvestment succeeds? What happens on the day after, in this legislature, you pass a bill that says, all right, we wash our hands of the South African situation? You will have shown your good faith, I suppose, but you won't be doing anything. You will, in fact, have taken the one road that relieves you of the real responsibility to do something, to get involved, to make a difference. And rather than using your imaginations to try to say, how can we take advantage of the influence we have, you will be saying, all right, how can we get these people off our backs so we won't have to worry about this problem anymore? And to be quite frank with you, I don't think that that's enough. I don't think that getting out is the solution. I think, as with a lot of other moral problems, getting out is precisely what we used to call it in the days of my youth. It's a cop-out. It is not the moral answer. It is just a moral excuse. It's not a moral approach. It's a way of trying to escape the practical consequences of a serious moral dilemma. And thinking through for yourselves, not how you show what good folks you are, but how you actually take the steps that can make a difference. I think I'll bring my own remarks to an end and take questions from the floor on this note. And express again my appreciation for having a chance to be here and share my thoughts with you.
Thank you, Dr. Keyes. And just to keep some semblance of order here, I'd like to ask that only the senators or House members first be given the opportunity to ask questions, and then any of the guests who are interested or still here, if you would wait until we are finished, then we'd be glad to stay and answer your questions. As you are recognized, would you please introduce yourself to Dr. Keyes and then ask your question, Senator?
A couple of stops aside. We have similar bills in the Senate, and I guess the thing that certain laws there are appropriations that are legislated they are like the topic of the Senate as the policy, and budget for not a lot of and we have members of the committee that speak today, both actually those bills are across the taxpayers and other percentages of that. The worst reason for doing it was all the help we can get And so I want you to know that that unless something untoward happens, you will not see divestiture legislation passed in the Senate of Pennsylvania.
Lynn Herman.
Thank you. I'm Representative Herman, Dr. Kazin. I just wanted you to expand on what you think foreign policy for the United States should be in this area.
Well, I think our policy up to this point. Well, I would say that the positive approach is pretty well summarized by a policy that has come under a lot of criticism and so forth, which I think in its basic principles makes a lot of sense. A thing called constructive engagement. You've probably heard those terms before. Now, what is constructive engagement? In the newspapers, you'll read a caricature a lot of the time of that policy. They'll call it quiet diplomacy, they'll call it doing nothing, and they'll call it sidling up to the South African government and so forth. So it is none of those things. Constructive engagement is exactly what it says it is. It is getting involved in order to build. That's literally what it means, constructive engagement. It is the opposite of not being involved, and it's the opposite of seeking merely to destroy something. It has involved our efforts to encourage change, both in the American business community, in the application of the Sullivan Principles, and for encouraging businesses to go beyond the Sullivan Principles in their pursuit of changes for the in the job situation, the home situation, the health situation, the educational situation of black people, and so forth. It has involved conscious efforts on the part of the U.S. government through scholarship programs that have been passed by the Congress, through encouragement of contacts between our labor organizations and labor organizations in South Africa, through encouragement of contacts between other kinds of organizations, civic and cultural and organizations in South Africa, to provide the kind of help that black people in South Africa need and that others who are struggling against apartheid need at a practical level in order to acquire the skills and build the organizational structures that they need to resist the abuses of the apartheid system. That includes providing help through various ways for those who are involved in efforts to deal with the abuses of the South African police power and legal system. So I think at that level, it is exactly what it says it is. And it is an effort to recognize the fact that change in South Africa will not come when the U.S. waves a magic wand, and it is not going to be the result of a simple change of heart on the part of white people in South Africa. It is going to be the result of a long-term effort by the black community as well as the white community. And we have to focus on the ways in which, through our involvement, both as a government and as private sector and private individuals, we can help the black community to increase the strength of its position in real terms, the position that it has to stand on in order to wage the struggle against the government. And that, of course, means that you have to look in some specific terms at the kinds of projects that have been implemented in educational and other terms by businesses as well as by U.S. government, other governments in South Africa. I am talking about the projects that have changed the nature of the kind of jobs that black people have, the kind of wages that they receive, the kind of training that they receive, both within South Africa and at institutions outside of South Africa. I'm talking about the encouragement that's given to labor organizations in South Africa, the help that the AFL-CIO has given to FOSATU and other labor organizations in their effort to organize black workers effectively. And that has borne fruit, as we can see, in the kinds of strikes that have taken place in the mines and other things, as black people make their move, making use of the power they do have to try to change their situation. And it's time we recognize that, and that our role is not to make a point about ourselves. Our role is to try to find concrete, specific ways in which we can help them in that kind of a struggle. And I don't see that disinvestment is a concrete, specific way to do that. I think it's a way of avoiding having to think about that particular problem.
Before I take a couple more questions, I do have copies of House Bills 3 through 8, which are prime sponsored by Representative Richardson, who is here with us this morning. And if you would like to have a copy of those as they came out of Finance Committee in the House, these are available to you up here. As you leave, you may want to take one. Representative Sesser, I think you had your hand up first.
I would like to know what your opinion is on the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Dr. Desmond Tutu, and his viewpoints on apartheid and what he's been saying for the last year on the issue.
the first thing I say to that is I try to refrain in all public comments from making comments about people. I have met Bishop Tutu. Like a lot of people, I have an enormous respect for Bishop Tutu. I also like to keep in mind, however, what I have had to keep in mind, what I think we all should keep in mind about the situation in South Africa, whether it's Bishop Tutu or millions of other black people who are actually involved in that situation. No matter how many times I have been to South Africa, I always try to remember that no matter what I do there, and no matter how much I try to explore the realities of the situation there, I don't know them. Because in the back of my mind, I know that I'm going to get on the plane and leave. And I'm going to leave those people behind there to deal with their problem in the way that they have to deal with that problem, balancing it with all the other things they have to do. And I've always said to myself, if I were there in the situation, what kind of a choice would I make? And I see the whole range of choices that black people make. And I say to myself, well, if it's your uncle they come for in your night, if it's your brother who's killed in the riot, if it's your children who are being destroyed, their education blasted, their prospect is gone by that system, it's not clear to me that you maintain your objectivity, or that your passions are under control, or that your anger is easily contained. It's not clear. And so, if there are individuals overcome with all those passions, who make choices, whether in favor of violence or other kinds of things, fine. And if you see individuals like Bishop Tutu, who have spent their whole lives facing that reality, and who have mostly resisted that temptation, then I think you have to greatly admire their courage as well as their wisdom. And so I think I don't have a right to comment on Bishop Tutu and his views. We have to take them into account as we approach this situation. But I would hope that Bishop Tutu and others would recognize that my situation is not the same, and neither is yours. We have a certain disadvantage because we don't really know the situation from the inside out, but we also have a certain advantage. And we have the advantage of being able to look at it without being blinded by those emotions on either side. Being able to keep in mind not just the anger we feel in our gut, but the sense of the long-term future for which we all hopefully are struggling, a positive future for all the people there. And we have the right, I think, to take advantage of that perspective. It's not something I think a lot of people in this country want to do. They would rather foment our emotions so that we can be blinded by them into doing things that in the short term satisfy those passions, but in the long term may do no one any good. So I think that there's a difference in perspective that we should keep in mind. And that as I respect Bishop Tutu for the courage with which he has been able to cope with his situation and with the situation of black people in South Africa, I would hope that he would respect myself and other people who are trying our best to figure out the way we can use our position to the best advantage, to an advantage that is on balance going to have a more constructive than destructive effect.
Representative Blatty.
Yes, sir. Tell me, the United States would disinvest, we actually build national level disinvestment in South Africa. How that would contribute to elimination of apartheid. Would that cause elimination?
Oh, I don't think anybody argues that this investment would cause the elimination of apartheid. We have about $2.3 billion invested in South Africa, relatively small proportion of the South African economy. Our companies employ something like, I think the last figure I saw was 66,000 workers in South Africa. Symbolically, it would be an important gesture. It would certainly argue for the South African government, well, we have to take notice of this fact. When you actually look at the complexity of South African politics, for instance, the kind of reaction to criticism from the Carter administration and so forth in the past, it's not clear how it cuts in South African politics. There would be some who would say, oh, the United States has done that, we'd better seriously move for change. There would be others who would resent it highly, and for whom it would harden their view that they have to ignore any outside interference in dealing with the situation. So as a symbolic gesture, it's not clear to me it would necessarily cut in a positive way. It does have the positive effect, and this is, I think, the most serious argument to be made for it. The most serious argument to be made for it is that black people in South Africa would sit up and take notice. And they might argue to themselves, oh, that means that the Americans really care about us. And we might get away with that for a while, we might. And for the first little while, they would say, gosh, that really means that they're interested in our welfare. But like other people, the question would then become, what have you done for me lately? And they would start to realize that disinvestment doesn't do anything for them lately. And after a short time, it wouldn't take long for it to dawn on them, that in point of fact, this marvelous gesture had been nothing more than that. And when they saw nothing following it up, nothing in the way of real changes, benefits, nothing in the way of real involvement, because we're not concentrating on that in case you haven't noticed, I think they would start to ask some questions. So even that symbolic benefit would be short-term and soon lost. And it would be all for nothing in the end. And then you would have to look at the real effects of that disinvestment on real people in South Africa. You know? I was just with Congressman Solar, I have heard the argument that he has made in the Congress and elsewhere about disinvestment problem. Congressman Solar, he's one of the leaders of the disinvestment movement in the U.S. Congress from New York. But in any case, he very often, I mean, the argument is made that the symbolic gesture is important. It shows that we're moral, and anyway, we have such little investment in South Africa that's not going to hurt so many people. And that's when you make the argument will hurt black people. It's only going to hurt 66,000 black people. I say you can't have it both ways. Either you're making the gesture because you have a significant lever it's going to make a difference, or it's not going to make a difference. But I also think it's important to remember that I, at least, am unwilling to say that's only 66,000 black workers. Because I do say to myself, 66,000 black workers, probably you have to multiply that in Africa by at least a factor of 4 or 5 before you start to get the average sized family that's being affected by that. And then we're up to 250,000 black people. And it's not just any 250,000 black people, it's 250,000 black people in that part of black South African society where black people are most likely to be able to have the kind of contacts, the kind of position that they need in order to struggle and help organize their brethren more effectively against the injustices of apartheid. And we will just sort of, without blinking an eye, wipe the slate clean of those 66,000 lives, forgetting that as you look at the history of anti-colonial struggles in Africa and Europe and elsewhere in the world, 1 or 2 lives have often made the difference. And how do we know which of those 66,000 workers is that 1 or 2? How do we know which of those people we are actually going to help with educational programs, management training programs, health programs, will actually be the ones that make a difference? How do we know how many of those people whom we could help with helping with legal services and other things in order to try to help them deal with the abusive system there? How do we know which one of those people is the one that makes a difference? Do we really just write those lives off and say their sacrifice is just another part of the struggle? That is not the way we, as Americans, usually think about the solution to the problem. Now, I know that there are regimes in the world who count human life for nothing, who do not see the potential of each individual as playing a critical role in one's progress toward justice. We, generally speaking, do. And I find it very, very unsettling when I hear people making these arguments about how the results of disinvestment in a negative way don't really matter. You know, I never used the word right with regard to South Africa the way we use it in the United States. Do they have the right to unions? Because you say you have the right to X in the United States. And that notion, that concept is supported by a whole superstructure of courts and laws and so forth and so on. And if you have the right, then you can find some way to assert it. I wouldn't use that term. I would say that black miners and other black workers in South Africa have unions. In order to keep those unions alive, they have to struggle every day. Some of them are unions that are recognized by the government, mixed race unions, other things that have been licensed, as it were, by the government. There have been some changes in the government's willingness to both license and deal with those unions. Others are black unions that the government does not want to work with and does not recognize. But you look across the board at some of the better-known unions, like Basatu and so forth and so on, and then you look at the South African jails in the course of the last 5 to 7 years, and among the roster of inmates in those jails, you will find a number of those labor leaders. And it seems that every time a crop of leaders springs up, the South African government takes its side and knocks off their head in some way or other in order to try to break the power of those labor unions in South Africa. That means that you don't have the right to a labor union in South Africa. You have the struggle to try to make that labor organization work. And it's a struggle that goes on every day against the odds of the police who are going to be coming after you, brutalizing you, victimizing you, trying in various ways to show that you are doing something that violates the law, that commits high treason. We can read about it in the paper today, and so forth. So you are working in an extremely hostile environment. It seems to me that we would have to go back a long time in the United States before we would see in some parts of our country the environment of hostility to labor organization that exists in South Africa today, and the kind of environment that labor organizers there, union leaders, have to work against when they see that the power structure of the society, particularly the police and court powers, are stacked against them. But I do think that in spite of all those odds, and this is the one thing, it's something I focus on, I don't know if other people focus on. Now, when you have a situation that's easy, and people choose to organize and so forth and so on, that tells you something about them. But when you have a situation that is almost intolerably difficult, and you still have people who are organizing, you still have new generations of leaders that are coming forward, you still have people who are persisting, that tells you something extraordinary about the people who are involved. And to neglect them as the key factor in the situation, in the face of all of that courage, all of that skill and cunning and shrewdness in dealing with such a hostile environment, seems to me very strange. And one can see the results, as one has seen over the course of the last year. There have been a couple of very serious strikes in the mines. The South Africa, at first, the mining companies were willing to work with the unions, and they tried to break the back of the unions through the importation of labor from the outside in order to weaken their club. So that it's a constant struggle. Not a question of having rights and merely asserting those rights. It's a question of the ongoing effort to maintain the reality of organizational contact among workers in key sectors in South Africa. And so it seems to me that that is, again, in my opinion, an argument that the people who are engaged in that struggle against the odds in terms of the system that they have to work amongst need all the help they can get. And rather than thinking about ways that we can put ourselves in the clear, we should be thinking about ways that we can find to assure that the American presence in South Africa will be working shoulder and shoulder with them in their effort to maintain these entities against the odds. Even as we work at government level to try to reform the South African government's approach to these labor unions and eliminate some of the abuses. But in the end, it seems to me that you don't get them to do that by going in and sitting down and chatting about it. You help black people and others in South Africa to create the inescapable facts that the government then has to deal with. And when those facts are in existence and are strong enough, they won't be able to escape dealing with them, no matter what they want to do. And it seems to me that we have a much more effective and constructive role to play in doing that. Now, it is not so easy to think of ways to do that. Instead of just passing a bill here, it might mean that several hundred people from all over the country, from labor organizations and other organizations, may actually have to get up and go to South Africa and work with South Africans in order to try to achieve something. Think of that. It might even require some involvement from the people of Pennsylvania and other parts of the United States, rather than just a symbolic gesture. It might even be tough and difficult to do something about this problem. It might not be as easy as a speech and the stroke of a pen. But that doesn't mean that the hard thing isn't the right thing to do.
Representative Foster.
Wrestled with this issue of very and comments very helpful. I just had an offer on the board of the debate that would require investment only in those companies that do not survive. So, I guess my question today is there hope for hope in South Africa avoiding some cataclysmic struggle? I think probably 5 years in South African position to rise higher in terrorist power. Is there a way that they can withdraw without being defeated by some of the extreme elements or the use of the exercise, especially the overall what's that?
Well, I am not a prophet. Anybody else, and I don't know the answer to that question. I would say that if you look at the periodic intensification of violence in South Africa, It's usually coincided over the last 10 or 15 years with recessions. 76, 77. Today, we always think of these things. I'm not saying that's a cause and effect argument, it's just something worth pondering, because it means that one shouldn't extrapolate from the present situation into sort of a hopeless prediction that nothing can be done. Second, I find it maybe not so strange when you look at the historical phenomenon. It's very often the case, we even had it in this country for a while, that precisely at the moment when certain changes are taking place, the rhetoric with which people look at the situation is most gloomy and hopeless. Why? Because you go from a situation where it's not a problem, because you don't see the abuses as abusive, into a situation where you suddenly realize, gosh, it's a terrible problem. And you see the abuses as abuses. Now, it's precisely at that moment when the sense, the consciousness of the abusiveness of the system is going to be greatest, that the greatest possibility of change takes place, because you finally perceive, God, there's something evil here, we better do something. I wonder sometimes whether we shouldn't be careful not to take that kind of a reaction for an indication of what the inevitable endpoint of the situation is. I don't think there is an inevitable endpoint to this situation. I think there are very good possibilities. Listen to anyone that talk about the embitterment of black youth in South Africa, the increasing alienation of large numbers of young people, seeing their future hopes blasted, seeing their dignity denied, and so forth. And they are being lost, larger and larger numbers, to any hope of reconciliation. And that's a problem. I don't know that you deal with that problem by getting out of the situation. I think that you deal with that problem by trying to go to those people where they are in order to offer them avenues to hope and change, which they may not see without your help. But that's neither here nor there. But it does exist, and that's a reason to believe, along with the South African government's attack on black leadership, attempts to discredit leaders who might be able to lead the situation in the direction of reconciliation. All of that is very bad sign. On the other hand, I think there are forces at work, as we have seen over the course of the last year. People dismiss these things. This is not important. This is cosmetic and so forth. In terms of changes in the Mixed Marriage Act and changes in the constitutional system and so forth. To be sure, those changes have not produced the desired result. And it's not even clear that they've been taken for the right reasons and so forth and so on. But one mustn't forget that apartheid, besides being an abusive fact, has been a very deep-rooted, almost religious ideology, based upon certain premises, exploiting a certain attitude and psychology toward the world on the part of Afrikaner whites in particular. Every time you take a step which denies those basic ideological premises, you are breaking one of the psychological underpinnings of the apartheid system. And as we all very well know, you win a battle like this, not just in terms of material changes, you win the battle on the nebulous battlefield of psychology. And it is precisely that battlefield, I think, over the last year and a half, 2 years, where a number of important changes have been made that indicate the possibility of important victories in the white community, including, by the way, one that only arcane studiers, I suppose, of the white community in South Africa would understand the significance of, but the split in the Afrikaner community. A split which was avoided like the plague and considered to be the worst of all possible evils in all the years since 1948, and a split which occurred in the course of the last 2 years, and which has forced the present South African government to rely not upon a hardcore true blue Afrikaner coalition, but upon a coalition that now consists in its own terms of Afrikaners, English, whites, and may even under this new constitution start to rely somehow or another on what they can get from the Indian and the colored communities. And more noise is now being made about the need to deal with the problem of urban blacks and so forth. Underlying difficulties are not being addressed by this government. That is true. The problem of grand apartheid, the situation in the homelands, the forced removal of black people, and so forth. All of those abuses continue, as we can see, and eventuate in real suffering and death for people. But then one sees, I think, the kind of concrete changes that are being produced, particularly in the economic sector, and that offer avenues of approach, particularly into the black community. And I say that, it is true. If we do nothing to exploit those avenues, then I think the worst will surely happen. If we try to work through those avenues to produce changes, not just in the whites and white attitudes, but in the black community itself that can make a difference, then I think there's a chance that we can avoid the worst. In the first case, you have no choice but the worst. In the second, the worst may come, but you still have a fighting chance to prevent it. Now you make the choice, and you tell me among those alternatives which is the moral way to go.
Representative Pitts.
Well, it's mixed. If you listen to Azapo and the ANC spokesman and so forth, then you will hear, and the PAC, the Pan African Congress, and its political arm, which I see a lot of at the United Nations. Then you will hear a lot of support for disinvestment and for the whole campaign of isolating South Africa in various ways. That is what I think of as the United Nations strategy toward apartheid, embodied in many resolutions and so forth and so on. And there is that support, and there is a question, about the kind of support within the black masses that has, because it is clear that certain figures are terribly important. And Mandela, his identification with the ANC. The African National Congress, when you actually carry it about, has a lot of support. It's not clear, however, whether that support is support for everything that they do, or support for the symbolic fact that they represent of black aspirations for justice. It's mixed, because that support runs across the whole spectrum of some people who have left the country, joined up, and other people who are still working in quite ordinary ways to change the situation more concretely. So you have that part of the spectrum. You have people like Bishop Tutu. Bishop Tutu's attitude toward disinvestment is this way and that. He has, in his latest pronouncements, made it clear that he thinks that yes, it has to be an alternative, but he wouldn't bring it into place for another couple of years, give him a couple of years, because he acknowledges the bad effects it may have, and so forth and so on. But I think in the end, he identifies with those who see it as an important symbolic. Then you have others, of whom the chief spokesman is Gacha Buthelezi, who is the head of the largest cohesive black movement in South Africa, the Inkatha movement, which counts 7 or 8 million Zulus among its membership. And Gacha Buthelezi has been for a long time, is today, probably will remain an opponent of the whole disinvestment movement. Had a very interesting article recently, I think, in the New York Times, in which he stated this case once again in terms of the bad effects that it would have on the black community and so forth. And so you have figures ranging all the way from one side of the spectrum to the other. The argument that I have made in the United Nations, and which I hope one will consider, at least thinking, is that it's clear that black people in South Africa and others who are working against apartheid have no single strategy on which they all agree as to how to deal with it. They are against it, and I think they are all working and struggling to eliminate. How they go about that, not clear. There are many different avenues. My problem is that I think that in the end, our job should be to assure that, especially where you're talking about the nonviolent part of the spectrum that is most in our interest, that governs the situation, we should assure that the full panoply of those choices is available to them. We shouldn't be making it our business to cut off part of that panoply by eliminating jobs, by eliminating corporate possibilities, and so forth and so on. That some, indeed millions of people there, seem to have chosen as their route to try to make a difference in their lives.
Representative Barber.
Well, I think that the answer to that is reasonably clear. If we weren't there, somebody else probably would be. Now, you have to explore that argument carefully, because there is the argument made that, I guess it was when the time is running out, which was the study that was done by the Rockefeller Finance Foundation. They did an extensive set of interviews and so forth with people in Europe about this question, with government officials and so forth, asking the question, would you disinvest? And they found, particularly in Great Britain, by the way, has a much larger economic stake than anybody else in this business, and it would really be damaging to the British, given the role that their investments are going to play in their economy to lead. But you also have the Germans and some other significant investors. And you even have people like the French who managed somehow or another in the world to get away with the most cynical devices. Okay, identified as terribly progressive while doing the least progressive things possible. I've never understood this, but the French get away with it in Africa, nobody else manages to. And so you have that spectrum of possibilities. Well, all the Europeans said that they were against it, and they wouldn't do it. There is the argument that, well, if we did it, they would then follow our example. I wonder about that, because I have found that the Europeans can be extremely sort of both cunning and cynical. And what they would probably do is that they would probably proceed to vote constantly in the United Nations in favor of sanctions and disinvestment following an American rule. Make a lot of noise about it, and so forth and so on, and then do what they do in a lot of other cases. That's when the UN passes some of these things. You know, when we pass in the UN or have something in the UN that's a code for regulating this or that, like the Nestle's formula business. Now, American businesses tend, because of the pressure of public opinion, to respond to that and to actually do what they're asked to do. European businesses tend to be able to ignore that because they're insulated from their political process. It's a lot better than our business people are. So in the end, you know, we pull out. They would proceed to demonstrate a lot in the UN and elsewhere what good guys they were, and then their companies would proceed to do business with South Africa. This is what would happen, in my opinion. And they would move into the making trucks and so on. And so I don't think that in the end, that's the other thing, of course, that could very well happen. It's been pointed out now in a couple of places. Wall Street Journal recently giving highlight to this fact. We have $2.3 billion investment in South Africa. And it is the ambition of a lot of states in the developing world when they can to nationalize their economy. Now, what you'd be doing if companies had to disinvest under pressure, basically, is that you'd be offering to domestic South African investors a chance to buy those assets at bargain basement price. And they would then run them. That's something you have to get. You don't even have to worry about forming. You have enough wherewithal in terms of potential capital for investors, in terms of management expertise and so forth. Most of those companies already have their management primarily staffed by South Africans, white or black, colored, whoever they may be. And as a result, the disinvestment would simply be a gesture of consolidating the control which Afrikaners and other white businessmen in South Africa have over the economy. Again, one of those things that just makes me scratch my head. Why would somebody against apartheid want to take a step that would consolidate the control of the economy in some critical areas, in the hands of Afrikaners, South Africans, instead of keeping it under the control of Americans, other foreigners who might be, and I think over the last several years have proven themselves to be susceptible to pressures to take an active role in producing positive change. You tell me what sense it makes. I've never been able to figure it out.
Are there any other representatives or senators that have a question? Okay, I'd like to open up to any of our guests that are here today. If you would like to ask a question, members of the House, I guess we're on the floor at 11, supposed to be.